So there are a few people who say that there's really no connection between the so-called historical Jesus and what it says here, that this Jesus never existed. They're in the minority, and most people, in my opinion, their arguments are not persuasive. For instance, Paul, right? Paul's letters are a lot earlier than the Gospels. Paul's earlier date back to when?
40.
Yeah, around 40, right? It's much more of a stretch to say that just 10 years later, Paul was making up all this stuff. It makes more sense to say that with the 40-year gap between Jesus and the Gospel of Mark, that stuff was made up. It's less plausible to think that Paul was making everything up. Does that make sense?
So, was the correct person you should believe what Paul says?
No. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the fact that there were people like Paul is good evidence that Jesus probably existed, and he probably was crucified. Because that's all Paul talks about, right? There was a guy named Jesus, he was crucified, and I think he's the Messiah. Now, that doesn't mean Paul's right, but it probably means that Jesus probably existed. Does that make sense? I think that Jesus was a real person. I think that some of what's in here is probably fictional. But I don't think that there's too much evidence that there was a guy named Jesus making waves in the first century to dismiss it altogether. Do you guys remember the death of Judas? How does Judas die according to, I think it was Matthew? And how is it different from Luke? Does anybody remember?
I don't remember which is which, but one, he just hung himself.
Yeah, in one, I think it's Matthew, he hangs himself. What happens to the other?
The other, like, he bought a field or something, and call it the field of blood, or I don't remember.
Well, in the other one, he goes to this field that he bought, and it says that he fell down and his guts burst open, right? His guts spilled out on the ground. I think I said when we read that people have tried to reconcile that difference by saying, like, he hung and then, like, the rope broke and then the rope, like, he collapsed after that. That seems to be a stretch to me to try to make all that work. In addition, since we're talking about these attempts to reconcile things, I want to look at, well, I'm not going to look at a specific passage. Ehrman suggests that if we try to reconcile these sorts of things, sometimes this results in us missing the point. What does he mean? Why does he say that? He says this specifically with respect to the Passover example. So those of you who did the reading, right? He says that when we try to reconcile this difference, we miss the point to some extent. Why?
We're going to go out on a limb here, but it's, instead of trying to figure out why they're different or to reconcile them, you know, we're missing the point, the message, maybe, of the story, or the point of what.
Yeah, that's pretty close to what he says. The key difference in John is that he suggests that in Mark, Jesus dies on the day of Passover. And in John, Jesus dies the day before the Passover. And he says the reason why John tells the story that way is to make it seem as if Jesus is the Passover lamb. Right? When did they kill the lamb? On the day of Passover or the day before? They kill it on the day before. So he says John seems to be rewriting the story to make Jesus parallel to the Passover lamb. Now, if we try to reconcile it, and we're focused on reconciling it, we'll probably miss John's point. Now, it doesn't, Ehrman wouldn't say, and John's point is true, and that's why we need to look at it, but we'll miss some of the unique emphases of John by running roughshod over the way he tells the story. We miss his theological point because we're so focused on making it fit with Matthew. Does that make sense? Right? He thinks that if we try to reconcile these things, we'll miss the unique emphases of each gospel author. Yeah. Can't think of another example off the top of my head to explain that.
Doesn't he say something like, when it comes to Matthew and Luke, like the differences and why there's so many differences, because one started telling a story and the other was just like continuing it, which is why they're so different?
That doesn't ring a bell. I mean, I talked before about how Acts was originally the second half of the Gospel of Luke, but I don't think that's what you're talking about. Do you remember which Gospel he was talking about?
Matthew and Luke. Or, I forget what it was. Said something like Matthew started telling the story and Luke was finishing it or continuing it, which is why it was different.
It doesn't ring a bell, but if you find it, we can look at it. Here's something, another example of what we were just talking about. According to Ehrman's explanation, my explanation, why does Matthew tell Jesus' birth story the way that he does? What is Matthew trying to accomplish by telling the birth story the way he did? Where Herod's killing the babies and they flee to Egypt.
And he tried to compare Jesus to Moses.
Right. It looks like he's trying to make Jesus look like another Moses figure. However, if we spend our whole time trying to say, okay, after this, then he did the thing in Luke, and then after the thing in Luke, then he did the thing in Matthew, and after the thing in Matthew, he did the thing. If we're piecing those together, we're probably going to miss the new Moses thing because we're trying to make it fit with Luke rather than looking at Matthew by himself. So I think Ehrman would say we're likely, if we're doing that stuff, we would miss the new Moses stuff that's unique to Matthew. Because Jesus doesn't really look like a new Moses if we squeeze the Luke story and the Matthew story together. We get a different version. You guys have a question? You found the passage?
I think I found it.
What page is it on? 33? Oh, okay. This is where he's saying one explanation. If you try to reconcile the discrepancies between Matthew and Luke as far as Jesus' birth, you might just say that Matthew's got one half of the story and Luke's got the other half. That's what the passage says. He says, now it may be that Matthew is simply telling some of the story and Luke is the rest of it, so that we are justified every December in combining the two accounts into a Christmas pageant where you get both the shepherds and the wise men, both the trip from Nazareth and the flight to Egypt. The problem is that when you start looking at the accounts closely, there are not only differences but also discrepancies that appear difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile. So, Dana, what he's talking about there is like some people try to reconcile, like, why does Matthew's version look so different from Luke? Well, Matthew had part of the story and Luke's got the other half, right? You know, if you I don't know, I can imagine. My wife tells me about stuff that happens at her school, and I get her version of the events, and sometimes I go ask her coworkers, what's your version of what happened, right? Maybe you can get two sides of the story. Some people try to explain, well, why is Matthew so different from Luke? Well, they both have they both have part of the story. But why is that inadequate for him? Why is that not a good explanation?